Let's jump right in. I want to ask, first of all, just like I said at the top, emotions, not necessarily in this setting, but in more intimate settings, can be very difficult to talk about. And I wanted to know why that is.
Okay, I'll start. So I'm a therapist, and a lot of times people will come into me and they'll say, I've never told anybody this before. And then the thing that they tell me doesn't feel like I really wonder sort of, why did they have so much shame around that particular thing? Especially men will do that, I'll say. Men will say, I've never told anybody this before. Women will come in and say, I've never told anybody this before, except for my mother, my sister, and my best friend, right? But they still have shame around it. And I think that we feel like talking about our feelings makes us very vulnerable. It makes us feel like, weak. It makes us feel like we're not handling our lives. And the reality is talking about your feelings is a sign of strength that says, I value my emotional well-being. I know that my emotional well-being impacts every other area of my life. But for some reason, we feel like it's easier to post something that feels quote unquote vulnerable on Instagram, but not really talk about what's going on with us.
I think it's absolutely right that we're afraid of coming across as weak. And especially for men, that's true, because we take our understanding of what emotional strength is about from action movies, like Liam Neeson. It's true, like Liam Neeson in the movie Taken. And I don't know if you've seen that film, but in it, very briefly, he plays an ex-operative whose teenage daughter is about to be abducted by sex traffickers and sold into slavery. And this is not a spoiler. It's called Taken. We know she's going to get taken. There were 2 sequels. She gets taken a lot. So she gets taken away screaming, and he gets on the phone with the bad guy. And the bad guy, and he says to the bad guy, and this became a meme, you should be worried because I have a very particular set of skills. But he delivers that line completely without emotion. Now, would it have made him any less brave if he would have said the same line with a tremble, with a lump in his throat? Would he have been less heroic for that? But that's the distortion we have in our culture. We believe that emotional strength is not about how you manage your emotion, it's about not having any. And that's not action, that's science fiction. That's just not how we are, because emotional strength is about the management. It's about how we come back, even if we cry, even if we're upset. And so we really need to change our understanding about the fact that talking about emotions is not a sign of weakness.
Yeah, I think what you both said makes a lot of sense. The only thing I would add is that I think it's really interesting that you said shame, because I think shame is the core emotion that we're so afraid to talk about. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that shame is actually the most stigmatized emotion. It's the most painful emotion to feel in cultures like this, in Western cultures. In Eastern cultures, it's very different. In those cultures, shame is actually important to feel. And if you don't feel or show shame, you're considered shameless, which is bad, right? It's sort of like
a sociopath.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas here, if you show any shame, it's a sign of vulnerability and weakness. And so we will go to extreme lengths to avoid admitting shame, avoid doing anything that might make us even go close to that feeling. And it's a problem because we do feel shame, right? And there are ways to cope with it, but if we're hiding it and suppressing it, that's sort of impossible.
I think also we value different emotions. We kind of put them on a hierarchy. Like people will come into therapy and say, not in these words, but help me not to feel, right? Because they don't want to feel certain emotions. Help me not to feel. They don't realize that by suppressing an emotion, it actually makes it stronger. And one of the feelings that they don't want to feel is envy when we talk about shame. And I always say to people, follow your envy. It tells you what you want. Our emotions are like GPS. They help to guide us. If you're feeling sad, why? It tells you something's not working. If you're feeling angry, what's underneath that? If you're feeling anxious, what is causing the anxiety? If you don't use it to guide you, then you're working with a glitchy GPS, and you're going to make choices and decisions and kind of end up lost.
Jessica, I want to go back to you for a second, because you think about all this from an evolutionary perspective. And we're going to spend, the majority of this session sort of talking about emotions at inside the kind of individual person. But give us a sort of zoom out for us and tell us, where did emotions come from? Why are they useful? What are their precursors in animals, that kind of thing?
Sure. Yeah, so there's a lot of evidence to suggest that for most emotions, we have them because we evolved to have them, which is to say they're functional, they're adaptive, they essentially help us survive and reproduce, or they help our genes survive and reproduce. That's not the case for every emotion, but for a lot of emotions, there's good evidence that we see them across all cultures that have been studied. So people everywhere show nonverbal displays of anger, fear, sadness, happiness in the same way. Pride, which is an emotion I've spent a lot of time studying, exists across all cultures. And we do see precursors of most of these emotions in other animals as well. For example, other primates, you see evidence of dominance and submission, which kind of maps onto pride and shame in humans. Fear, there's evidence for that in all kinds of animals. And so if you think about emotions in that way, I think it gives you kind of a different perspective along the lines of what Lori was saying about think about how to use or what your emotions are doing for you. Because from an evolutionary perspective, the reason we have emotions is because they do things for us, right? They help us in certain ways. Now, the ways that they help us might not be the ways that we want them to help us today, right? Because they're sort of helping us in terms of the way that we evolved in this different environment, many, many years ago to essentially survive and reproduce when we lived in a very different way than we do now. And you can imagine in those days, if there was something I was really bad at or had a flaw that was gonna get me in trouble, feeling an emotion like shame, that would be a signal to me to say, hey, you better hide, you better submit and allow yourself to be subordinate to that other person, because if you let this flaw come out, you're gonna get hurt, you're gonna get potentially injured and destroyed in some sort of battle. The problem is now I feel that and I still wanna hide and avoid and escape, and that's probably not the most adaptive solution, right? There's probably better ways to handle it in the kinds of groups that we live in today. But those feelings, they're kind of ancient, right? They're coming from a different time. And so it's hard to override them, or it's hard to sort of say, okay, wait a minute, I'm feeling this because I evolved to feel it, or my genes want me to feel it, but maybe in the world I live in now, I don't need to feel this way, or I don't need to respond to it this way.
And are there, so of the kind of precursors, you mentioned dominance and submission, which you find certainly in the great apes or among lions or something.
Yeah.
What are the emotions that humans have kind of like really developed and complexified that we look at? There almost is no comparison because humans have made them sort of so much richer and more complicated because we have written culture and all these things.
Right. I mean, every emotion in humans is going to be more complicated than it is in any other animal, of course, because we have, way higher cognitive complexity, but also we have these complex sense of self, right? We have an identity that we care deeply about. No other animal, even chimpanzees, no other animal has the kind of identity and identity concerns that we have, and that drives a lot of what goes on. But I think, you can think of something like fear, the fear that you feel when you hear a noise in the night. And the way that you react to that probably is fairly similar to the way that any animal across the animal kingdom might react to some sort of sudden danger, right? So that's much more similar, whereas something like envy, since you mentioned that, it's hard to imagine other animals feeling anything like that, right? I mean, that really is about our social structure, our social networks, knowing where we stand in a hierarchy, being aware of others around us, who we compare to, being aware of our own identity concerns and who we want to be. And you need all that kind of stuff in place. You need to be thinking about that. You need to have the ability to think about that in order to experience something like that. So, yeah.
And I would add that I think that what makes it complex is that we have these emotions, and then we have a layer of emotional reactions to those emotions, and that's what doesn't happen with animals. And what happens with that is what I find, and I'm a clinician, so I see this in people that I speak with, is that the constant question that arises for people, whether they articulate it or not, is there something wrong with me for having that secondary reaction? Is there something wrong with me for feeling what I'm feeling? And what I think is really important for people to understand is that the emotional experience we have in certain situations is going to be largely universal. If you're sitting at a desk at work and you see your colleagues going to lunch without you, that is going to hurt, even if you hate every single one of them. And there are plenty of studies that show it, that when we despise people, but if we feel rejected by them, it hurts. And in some of those studies, even when we find out that a rigged rejection wasn't real, it still hurts. It's difficult to unwind that. And so what is different is our expression of that. How each of us might express this and how different cultures express the emotion will vary. But the experience, the initial response to the triggers that cause it are going to be pretty much universal in a very large way.
And I think we also make up stories about what happened. So in the example of, your coworkers, even if you hate them, go to lunch, they rejected you. They may have gone to lunch because they know you don't like them. It's not that they reject you. They feel rejected by you, and that's why they didn't invite you, right? So we make up all these stories, and a lot of the stories exist in our heads, like I'm unlovable, or I'm unworthy, or nothing's ever going to work out for me. These are like common themes that people come in with. And people talk to themselves. If I were to ask you, who's the person you talk to most in the course of your life? Is it your partner? Is it your best friend? Is it your sibling? Who is it? It's yourself. That's the person you talk to most, and we are horrible to ourselves. I had this woman, I said, write down everything that you say to yourself in the course of a few days. And she came back the next week, and she said, she tried to read it. She's like, I can't read this out loud. I can't say this out loud. And she's like, I am such a bully. And the things that we say to ourselves, we are so unkind to ourselves. We would never talk that way to a friend. We wouldn't have any friends if we spoke that way. So we wouldn't. I mean, we walk through, if you could hear what people say to themselves as they're walking down the street, if you could go into their heads, it would be this cacophony of self-loathing and criticism. And, and so I think we make up these stories, and most of these narratives are faulty narratives. And that's important because those faulty narratives inform our feelings.
Can I ask you, and to thinking about my own emotions, I don't want to be like Liam Neeson. Some of that self-dialogue that's really negative seems to me that it's reflective. It's not like an active agency. I will now talk to myself in this negative way. It just those are the thoughts that spring from the kind of darker corners of my imagination. So how do you help people improve the way they talk to themselves? I
think the first thing is to notice that you're doing it. So a lot of us just walk around and we've got this radio station playing in our head, and it's this horrible radio station that you can't turn off. And so the first thing is to notice, change the station. You got to change the station. Everybody needs to notice that the station is playing and then change the station. And it's not then that you're all of a sudden going to be your biggest cheerleader and you're going to play this phony station. It's that you need to have some reality, right, to what you're telling yourself. If you can be more accurate about how you perceive the world around you, about how you relate to yourself and how you relate to others, you will do better at relating. But if you don't have accurate information, you're going to keep making all these distortions and projections and get yourself into trouble.
And how do you know when it's the sort of bad self-talk and when it's the GPS that you ought to be following?
So many people think that their problems are external to them, right? It's this person, it's that person, it's this circumstance, and it's sort of like Sartre's thing, hell is other people, right? But sometimes hell is us. And sometimes we are the cause of our problems, and that means that we need to understand what our role is in the situations that we find ourselves in. And if there's that saying that if there's a fight in every bar you walk into, maybe it's you. So we need to look at what is my role in this.
And I would add to that. First of all, I believe that in terms of being self-critical, this internal self-critical voice, it has zero value, none. And some of these are very intrusive thoughts. You don't ask for them, but you just didn't get the promotion at work. You're walking down the street and loser, such a loser, right? Really. And it's very, now you can't necessarily stop the intrusive self-critical thought from coming in. But you can introduce one to argue with it. And that's what you absolutely should do. I believe in a zero tolerance for the self-criticism for this reason. Is it important, if you didn't get the promotion, to look at what I might have done wrong, where my mistakes might have been, where are the missed opportunities? Absolutely. You do need to look at that. You just don't need to call yourself an idiot while you're doing it. Because the idiot part doesn't add any value, but that will demoralize you. That will abolish your motivation. That will, similarly as when somebody's screaming at you, all you notice, that person's screaming at me, you're not quite listening to what they're saying. And so you will lose all the good stuff that you need to be thinking about in those cases because you're so busy orienting toward I'm a loser and I'm an idiot. So I find there's zero utility, and we have all kinds of ways to justify this internal critical self-voice, like, oh, it'll prepare me for the future. No, it'll just demoralize you. What will prepare you is to, be like a detective. Go in, without the value judgment. Just note what needs improvement, what you can do differently. You don't have to smack yourself in the side of the head to make yourself pay attention. You can pay attention without it.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are great points, and just sort of to add to that, I think it's interesting to think about this from an evolutionary perspective, because the reason that we have this kind of sensitivity when my coworkers leave for lunch without me, the reason that's such a threatening thing is because it's adaptive to feel that way, right? In our evolutionary history, if we didn't have groups, we would die. We needed the people around us for our very survival. And so we're super attuned to being sensitive to threats of being abandoned, right? Threats of our groups not wanting us and wanting to exclude us. So when that happens, it triggers this whole emotional system, which again is ancient, right? And that system gets activated and it takes over. But I think what you both are saying is we don't have to let it take over, because we can sort of outsmart our emotions in this sense, right? They're the ancient animalistic parts of us. We can then step in and say, okay, I'm having this response. Does it need to take over? Let me think about another way of thinking about it. Don't ignore the event, right?
Yes.
Be aware of it, but don't let the emotional part take over.
And I always say our mind is a very powerful tool, but it requires adult supervision. We need to step in, and we need to use our intelligence and use our smarts and use our knowledge to argue with it and not just let it go on autopilot, because it'll go to the wrong place.
Lori and Guy, you both have mentioned how if you are to ignore a negative emotion and suppress it, that it actually grows stronger. And I was wondering, do we actually understand the kind of mechanics of how that works in the mind? Like, do we know if you sort of receive some emotional injury, and we can move off the lunchtime rejection example, or we can use a different one. How does that sort of compound when we're not addressing it?
It's kind of like this woman came into me, and it was my very first patient, and I'd never sat with anybody before. And by the way, if you ever can even imagine that this person had no idea that it was my first therapy session, I felt anxious about that. But she came in and she immediately started crying. And she said that the reason she was there was that she couldn't stop crying. And then she continued to cry. And she was sitting like this far away from me, and I didn't know, like, should I look at her? Should I not look at her? Should I say something? Should I not say something? She just kept crying and crying and crying and crying. And finally I said what I thought was the stupidest thing that a therapist could ever say in the history of the field, which was, I said, "You seem really depressed." And then I thought, oh my God, she's going to ask for another therapist. Can you get fired on the first day? I don't know. And she stopped crying because I had named what she was feeling. She said, "Nobody has said that." And she was so relieved that somebody had seen her sadness, had seen her depression. And so I think when she'd been trying to push it down, she'd been trying to pretend that she wasn't feeling that way. And once you give your feelings some air, you can breathe better too. And that's exactly what happened for her. And we have all these strategies for not feeling our feelings. Sometimes we like to toss them onto other people. Like, I'm having a bad day at work, so I'm going to make you feel bad, and then I'm going to feel great because I don't have to hold that feeling anymore. We do all kinds of things not to feel them, but the problem is that they're still there. So when you ask, what is the mechanism, it's kind of like, don't think about the elephant. Don't think about the elephant. Well, you're only going to think about the elephant.
So I think there's something really important here, and that is that when we are hurting, for whatever reason, when we experience some kind of emotional wound, say, we're meeting our spouse for a movie and they're 30 minutes late, and we're sitting there and we're stewing and we're really aggravated and we're really upset. We want one thing in all those situations more than anything else, and that is to have our emotions validated. We want to feel understood. And when I talk to people about that, I say to the late spouse, your first job here is to validate your partner's feelings. Before the excuses, before the explanations, before the buts, is just to validate. And that would look like something like, look, I get why you're so upset, because you didn't know how late I would be. I wasn't responding to my text, and with every minute you're wondering, are you going to be stood up, and what's going on, and why am I being so inconsiderate? I imagine how worked up you must be after 30 minutes. That will have a paradoxical effect, because we fear that saying that will, yeah, you're right. And but it does the opposite. It absolutely is cathartic. And the thing is, it still allows you to complete that sentence and say, but check the email, we said 7:30, not 7. But if you start with, but we said 7:30, not 7, you're going to have a very pissed off spouse sitting with you at the movie. So that emotional validation piece, that's the thing that we want most. We need to know that our emotions are valid and that people see them. That's what therapists do, fundamentally, even in a first session.
Lori, I wanted to ask you one of the really neat things about your most recent book, maybe it was why Eva Longoria was so attracted to it, is that you yourself are in therapy and you're also a therapist. And I wondered, is it harder, like I feel for your therapist because you know all the tricks for the trade. Oh, I didn't mean that.
No, I did.
Was it harder for him to sort of excavate under your emotional layers, given that you can kind of see every move coming?
Yeah, so in the book I'm following the stories of 4 of my patients. They're very different people with very, very different histories and issues, and their lives are very different. But I was also going through an upheaval in my own life at the same time, and I felt like it would be disingenuous to have them be so vulnerable and then me be the expert up on high and not show what was happening in my own life at the same time, because therapists go to therapy, right? And so I'm the 5th patient and I go to therapy. And I think when you are, when you're training, you have to go to therapy for licensure, but it's different because you're an intern and you don't feel like a therapist, you just feel like a regular person. And then you have a practice and all of a sudden you go back to therapy, and it's hard at first, I think, to take off your therapist hat. And I think most of us, because of shame, what we were talking about earlier, there's a performative aspect, I think, when people first come to therapy, that they want the therapist to like them, like we all do. And so I think we don't reveal everything that we might need help with, that we might need to talk about. So I really had to take off my therapist hat and just be a person in the room. And I did a lot of things with my therapist that my patients do with me, because I was just a person. When I would walk out and I'd see somebody in the waiting room, I'd think, I wonder if he likes her better, or like he must dread my session. That was a bummer for him. But I think that one of the beautiful things, and Guy can talk about this too, of what happens in therapy is that it's this very rich human experience. I think there's so many misconceptions about what it is, and it's really 2 people in a room talking about someone's life and what all of the things that we might feel shame talking about out in the world, but so that we can actually look at them and help people to make adjustments in whatever's not working.
Guy and Jessica, do you both go to therapy? If you're comfortable sharing.
Back in the day, when I was training, I did. I haven't for many years. I do want to add one thing about that people always ask me whether I like my patients. Like, what happens if you don't like someone? And an interesting thing happens. My job when I see someone is to understand them, is to see things from their perspective, is to really get where they're coming from, even what they're trying to hide, the shame they're trying to avoid, the pain they're trying to avoid. And when you see that, when you are looking at someone from that angle, you can't not like them, because you understand them, you get them. And so you can't not. It's just not happened to me that I've sat with someone and thought, oh, I really don't like this person. If I am thinking that as a therapist, I'm not really listening with any kind of empathy, and that's a problem. And I'll reorient myself to I need to get in there and really understand this person, even if they seem hard to understand at first. And so I just want to reassure any of you who are in therapy or thinking of going, therapists typically do like all of their patients because they truly see them.
And I just want to add one thing to that when I was training, one of my supervisors said to me, there's something likable about everyone. It's your job to find it. And I thought, well, that can't be true, right? Because we all know people. What if, because I was really nervous, what if that happened? Like Guy was saying, we all worry about that. You get in the room, and what happens is if people show you the truth of who they are, it's impossible not to like them. You will find aspects of yourself in every single person you see, even if your lives are completely different, because we have these universal human experiences. We are all more the same than we are different. But if people keep you at bay, if they won't show you the truth of who they are, you don't know if you like them because you don't actually know who they are yet. And so many people think that I want to hide the truth of who I am. I don't want people to really see who I am. And ironically, that prevents people outside the therapy room, that prevents people from liking you. If you show them who you really are, that's the glue that will draw people toward you. And I don't mean TMI, I don't mean, kind of gratuitous, let me tell you everything about my life. I mean, if you're authentic with other people, they will be drawn toward you. But so many of us spend so much time trying to put up a false self so that people will like us, and it's counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, just I'll answer your question. I have been in therapy, and I found it super useful. And it's funny that it's I haven't for a while, but when I have, as someone who studies emotions, I go in there and it's just amazing how much I learn, because I'm not trained as a clinician. I don't know anything about what you both do, and it's amazing how much someone who does what you do actually can just get in there and figure out what's going on in a way that, someone like me who actually spends a lot of time thinking about how all this stuff works at a big picture level has a really hard time seeing when it comes to my own stuff. And I think that's how we all are, right? That you can understand something at one level, but when it comes to your own issues, you're so tied up in what's going on in your life, it's hard to get any perspective, which is what's really useful.
I would like to add one thing. I think one of the things that makes it really difficult for people, people who come to see me, but people in general, is that we don't have a language for emotions. Our emotional sophistication is very unsophisticated in a way. In certain experiments, you'll say to someone, like in one experiment, the question will be, you walked into a party and overheard two people two friends, speaking poorly about you. How would you feel? And most people's responses to that will be upset, or angry, or upset and angry, hurt, primary colors. Now, if I asked you the same question, and I gave you a list of 30 emotions, and I asked you, to what extent do you feel each one of these? You would probably find, I felt a little bit guilty because I wasn't that nice to that person, so maybe I get why they're saying that. And I also felt a little bit outraged, and I felt a little bit relieved because I didn't really want to be friends with him, so maybe that's a good time. In other words, our emotions are tapestries, not threads. And we think of them as singular threads. And so it's very difficult for us to describe how we feel to our therapists, which is what happens in therapy most of the time, and certainly to ourselves. And if we were more emotionally sophisticated, even in the language, even in being able to identify the threads, the thickness of these threads, the nuances, that we can have contradictory feelings at the same time, that would be very, very useful.
Yeah, I mean that's just to jump in. That's really interesting, because I study emotions from this perspective, that we can differentiate them, and that different emotions are quite different from each other. And one way in which they're different is in terms of their functions. So if you're feeling guilt, that's doing something different for you than if you're feeling sadness or fear. And so actually knowing that and being able to figure it out, maybe with the help of a therapist, could actually be really useful in terms of figuring out, okay, well, this is why I want to do this, but this is why at the same time I feel like I should go out and talk to this person, and but at the same time I want to avoid them, and so maybe teasing apart the emotions can be helpful in that way.
And also, it's so important what both of you are talking about, which is that they're multi-layered. So you're not necessarily just feeling one homogeneous feeling at one time. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that we say we want to be happy, whatever that means, joy, let's call it. And yeah, that's right. There's a word, cherophobia, which means fear of joy, right? Chero means to rejoice in Latin, I think. And so there's so many people who, when they start to feel joy, they're also feeling something else. They're feeling terror. Because there are people for whom feeling joy feels dangerous. It feels like, the other shoe's gonna drop. It's not gonna last. So I don't wanna get too comfortable in this place of joy because it won't last, something bad will happen, I will be punished for my joy. So for them, joy isn't pleasure, it's anticipatory pain. So they're feeling this all of these different emotions, and they can't really feel joy. So it's really important to be able to tease out the complexity of what we're feeling in any given moment when it gets in our way.
I can feel a sort of ambient desire to ask some questions from this audience, and I'm gonna do that in 1 minute. But first, I wanted to hear from each of you if there were either a practice or a concept that you wish people would kind of add to their emotional toolkit. What would it be?
I would say that one of the most fundamental things that I've learned about the human condition from doing therapy is that we grow in connection with others. That fundamentally what we all want is to love and be loved. And if we are having trouble with connection, if we aren't finding enough connection that is nourishing us, then the most important thing you can do is say, how can I have more connection? Is anything getting in my way? What can I do? And that alone will improve the quality of your life exponentially.
And I would say, just as a general rule of thumb, if you're feeling something, it's valid. Don't ask whether, should I be feeling this, should I not? What does it mean that I'm feeling this? It's valid. It means that the vast majority of people would feel a measure of that in that situation. The intensity might change, but they'll feel strands of that, of whatever you're feeling. And secondly, as we're saying, there is information there, and very useful information. So don't waste time wondering, feeling bad about the fact that you're having the feeling. Get curious. Because when you get curious, there's a defense mechanism there. It takes it to an intellectual level, which distances you from the emotion and allows you to think more freely. So A, don't question whether it's valid. It is. And B, get curious about what information and useful information might be there.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with both of these perspectives that emotions are useful. That's probably the main thing I would say, that we should use our emotions. But I think the other way we can use them besides informationally, which is absolutely true, is to bear in mind that they also motivate us to do stuff. They make us kind of want to engage in various behaviors. And that can be really useful as well, right? So I study pride, and there's a lot of research suggesting that when we feel pride, or when we want to feel pride, that's what motivates us to work hard, to persist, to do difficult things, to try to become the kind of person we want to be. That can be a really useful thing. So if sort of we're feeling like, oh gosh, I'm feeling kind of prideful, maybe I shouldn't, because there's a lot of stigma about that. That is not necessarily the best way to respond. That actually allowing yourself to go for those feelings can be really useful. And that's the case for a lot of emotions. I think sadness is another good example, because when we're feeling sadness, really what that motivates us to do is to seek help, right? Seek nurturance, seek care. And that's really what we need when we feel sadness. It's a message that we need others to care for us. We know this when we see babies that are sad. We know what they need. It's the same thing with adults. And so I think not hiding away from that, not saying, oh gosh, I better tamp down those feelings, but actually saying, hey, who can help me? Who can take care of me right now? And looking toward that could be a really useful response.
Okay, I want to go to some questions, and please do wait for the microphone. Also, Guy told me before this session that he often tells people in contexts like this that you should feel liberated to say that you're asking for a friend. So, that's great. Let's go right here. Here comes.
In our world where suicide in teenagers has become even more epidemic than it had been over these last 10 years or so, and where many of us are raising boys and trying to help them explain and express their feelings and name those feelings, why it feels like we've gone backwards. Our generation is a generation that was encouraged to express feelings and teach our boys to express themselves, but they're suffering. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how we help our boys and men in this society who are still so stifled in expression of using language around emotion, to move forward in that way. And I think it is uniquely different between men and women, no matter how much. I know it's hugely environmental as well, but thoughts on this?
You know, when women start to cry in therapy, often what they'll do is they'll say, I'm sorry, like as they're crying, I'm sorry. They're apologizing for their pain. Men apologize, I think, by holding it back, by holding back their tears. But I see a lot of couples in my practice, and when you see the women will say, I want you to share your feelings with me, I want you to be open with me. And then he does. Look at the look of horror on her face when he starts crying. I'm serious. And so it's this thing where they're getting this mixed message, which is, I want you to be vulnerable with me. I want you to let me in. I want to be able to see you. And then when he says, here, you can see me, she's frozen. She doesn't know what to do with that. She wants to get him to stop crying. She's incredibly uncomfortable. And I think that's something that we talk about culturally too. It's not just interpersonally between the two of these individuals, but it's something much bigger than what's going on in just that room. And I think, in answer to your question about what we can do about it, my son is 13, and in his school they have a wellness program where they talk about emotions all the time, and he has practiced talking in front of girls, in front of other boys, about how he feels. I don't know any of it because he won't share it with me, but none of them. The girls won't share it with their parents either, right? And that's great that they have a place to learn like what Guy was saying, the language of emotions and what happens, and the positive reinforcement you get for when you do that. But I think we as adults have to model that for them. And if your parents are the people who, when your dad starts crying, your mom freaks out, that's not going to be a good example for you.
Yes, right over there.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for your insights today. I wanted to ask about your theories of shame and emotion and how they change when you're working with patients who are abuse survivors, veterans, or others who have experienced trauma. And I'm also interested how these theories hold up when you're thinking through lenses like institutional racism and income inequality. And I would appreciate your thoughts on that.
Oh, that's a simple question.
I was going to say, does one of you want to take that one?
First of all, just to make this distinction, it might be obvious. The difference between shame and guilt is guilt, you feel bad about an action, something you've done. Shame is about who you are. Now let's talk about veterans, for example. A lot of times people feel that they can only really open up and talk to people who've experienced what they've experienced. A lot of veterans feel very lonely when they come back, even though they're surrounded by loving friends and family, because they feel like, I can't really talk about my experiences because they won't get it. And actually they might get it well, but the feeling is they won't. I can talk to another vet. I can talk to someone who actually has been through this experience so they can get it. So the first step usually is to be able to match someone. And usually when they come to therapy, they consider, okay, you do get it because you're an expert of sorts. But shame is an extremely toxic experience. And the first thing that's important is to validate that it's natural to feel it in certain circumstances. But I always say the fact that your mind is generating that emotion doesn't mean that that's the only emotion you should have. It doesn't mean that you're bad. This is your mind's response to something. This is where the adult supervision kind of has to kick in. And I'm always advocating that people get interested, and you do this as well, people get interested in the emotions they feel, that they start to explore them, especially if it's shame. What is that really about? Is that an overreaction? Is that an underreaction? Is that an accurate reaction to the context? And in that exploration, A, there's again this emotional distance, but B, there's understanding that they can glean and start to move forward with. I actually forgot some of the other aspects of that question.
I'm mainly curious. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is generalized to the main population, but there are so many people in this country who are dealing with structural issues that are in some ways more impactful than their own personal emotional health. And so I'm curious to see, when you have these overarching structural issues, how does that change the practice?
I think when you have these overarching structural issues, there are these stressors that are in their lives that are, in addition to whatever sort of intrapsychic, kind of issues that they might be struggling with. And they're fluid, they impact one another, right? And so I think you have to take that into account. You can't just say to a person, tell me what's going on in your life, and here's what's going on with your parents, or here's what's going on with your sibling or your partner, and not take into account the context in which it's all happening, and to talk about the context. And I think that some people are, again, ashamed to talk about the context because they think that it might be different. I also think that certain cultures feel differently about talking about their inner lives, and sometimes people come to therapy and their families are very against it. Like, they don't want people to talk about what's going on because they feel like it will reflect badly on them. Or we just don't do that, or we do stiff upper lip, right? We don't do this thing. And something's wrong with you if you're going to go talk to somebody and you're going to an outsider. So really talking about those things and bringing, giving them air in the room so that they're not this undercurrent in the room that nobody's talking about.
Right here.
This is for the two therapists. This is on. So, are you familiar with Ray Dalio's work on radical transparency in the workplace?
Yes.
I'm not.
Sorry,
Oh.
I am.
Okay.
So directed toward
so
him.
my question is, I mean, what are your thoughts and feelings about that radical transparency, both in the workplace, but also in your personal relationships, whether you're detecting a certain emotion or feeling from someone you're talking to, you may know them well or not well, or a close friend? I mean, I have my own views, but I'm curious about yours.
Okay, so what he advocates, or what he apparently does in his company, is if there's a meeting and it's with him, you know, the head of the company, down to a very minor person, everyone gets to comment thereafter about the meeting. A very, not minor, a very low-level employee can say, well, Ray, I think it was stupid the way you said, you know, such and such. And so it's radical honesty that at all levels. That's the theory of it. Now let's distinguish between doing that at work and doing it in your personal life.
I don't know anything about this theory, but already I can see lots of people coming to me for couples therapy after practicing this.
First of all, absolutely not radical honesty in couplehood.
Yes.
No. You don't need to be, in other words, there's diplomacy, there's tact, you know, those are good things. In the workplace, his goal is to really enhance very open communication throughout all levels of the company. And to that extent, it certainly does that. These are his principles. I don't know how much it's been studied. I don't know the real impact of it, whether, you know, he's a very successful person, you know, Ray Dalio, so something's working there. I don't know if it's this. So I would want to see research about whether that actually works in other organizations and whether it's practiced correctly and what people do with hurt feelings, because there are going to be lots of them. In your personal life, no.
Right here. Did we lose the mic?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. We're just.
Can you raise your hand again, whoever it was? Thank you.
How do you handle when you give feedback, like in the workplace or to a spouse, and they, rather than take it, they react to it, and then, like, I will get upset by how they're reacting to it.
So,
How do you stop that kind of drama?
I talk in my book about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. Idiot compassion is, when you say, someone's complaining about something and you're like, yeah, you're right, your boss is a jerk, this person wronged you, whatever. You support whatever they said without even thinking about what might else be going on. Wise compassion is, what you're talking about is giving feedback, is sort of holding up the mirror to the person and saying, hey, here's something, I want you to see your reflection, and I want you to look at something that you might not already be aware of. A therapist can do that very well. When you're giving feedback to somebody else, you have an agenda. Part of your agenda is, I need you to change so my life will be easier, right? And they know that. So you might say you're being very altruistic and you're giving them this feedback, but part of giving the feedback is, there's whatever percentage, right, is that you want them to change. And as therapists, we don't have the same agenda. We want them to change for their benefit, but I think we don't have our own needs mixed up in it. So when people are reacting poorly to your feedback, sometimes it's because of the presentation of the feedback. Even if you're doing it with compassion, they will hear it as, you're asking me to do something to please you, or you are criticizing me. And if they're having a bad reaction, I would not keep going in there, like, keep putting the knife in, because they're not hearing you, and they don't want to hear it, and whatever you're doing is not helping them to hear what they need to hear.
May I just quickly add something?
Yes,
Just
right.
just very.
I
Oh,
work
please.
with dyslexia and ADHD, so I'm the director of a program, and I'm giving feedback about another child to another educational therapist. This particular therapist, who's excellent, gets great results. When I do that, he just says, I guess I'm just not doing a good job. And it gets me frustrated because I'm not saying that, I'm just giving him my expertise.
So look, you might want to point out that he's listening to you with his gut instead of his ears. His ears are up here, attached to this, and he needs to be more considerate of it. In therapy, a quick little secret, of couples therapists, that if that happens, I'm working with a couple, I'll give somebody feedback and they will respond in a very upset way or in a very angry way. That's how they'll typically respond to their spouse. It's my job not to respond as the spouse does, because then we're just replicating the same dynamic, right? It's my job, and so what I'll do is I'll point it out. And I'll say, like, that's an interesting reaction. Now, if it were to him or to her, they would probably do this, which gets you into your very worn-out script that everyone's bored with, including me. So let's look at a different kind of reaction. I'm empathetic to a point. Let's look at a different kind of reaction, but I'll bring it in as a dynamic that's going on.
That might be hard for her to do to a coworker.
With a coworker, I would again say, like, you're hearing it here, you're not actually absorbing it here. So what does that mean to you if you actually try and listen to the content?
We've got time for one more question.
I think he's been wanting to ask a question for a
I will
long
go to him in 1 second, but first I'll use my moderator's privilege,
Yes.
which is to ask you a follow-up about idiot compassion.
Yeah.
Do you think that people maybe need a kind of balance of idiot compassion and wise compassion in their life, or should it be all wise all the time? Like sometimes you just need people to sort of be on your team for a minute.
You know, I think timing and dosage are important. So, timing is the person just felt the injury. They don't want the wise compassion in that moment. They want to be heard. What Guy was saying about being understood. You don't have to agree with them. So please understand that understanding somebody doesn't mean that you agree with them. It just means you understand they're feeling that way. When the injury immediately happens, they're bleeding, right? Emotionally bleeding. They want to be heard in that moment. When I was starting out as a therapist, we would talk a lot to try to make somebody feel better in that moment. And a supervisor said, "You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's a reason for that ratio." And if you can just listen to them without trying to fix it in that moment, that's what they really need. Now, as timing goes by, right, a week later, they might be able to hear something that you couldn't say in that moment. And the dosage, you're not going to give them the whole, throw the whole ball at them with all this information. They're not ready to hear it. So in therapy, we sort of dole it out, right? And knowing that, let's try this dosage. Let's see how they react to it. Oh, they reacted really well to that dosage. I can double the dosage now, right? And you can do that with your friends too.
Okay, right here.
Hi, Muchu. I'm from Zambia, and my question is to Lori. I make reference to your first therapy session. You mentioned how the woman had just broken down and she wasn't communicating her problems with anybody else. And I think there's a lot of truth in that in a lot of relationships. And what have you found are effective ways of partners ensuring that their significant other is open to them in terms of what problems they are facing?
That's such a great question. I think about the writer Andrew Solomon told this story about how he was at a conference and these 2 people who were married separately came up to him and confessed that they were depressed and they had been using antidepressants. So they were hiding the same medication in the same house, right? If that was reflux medication, that never would have happened. It would just be sitting in the medicine cabinet, open on the counter. Nobody would care. So I think that we really do have trouble talking to our partners when we're struggling, unless we're talking about why they're causing us to struggle. That we're really good at doing. Nobody holds back. But it's much harder to say, I'm really struggling. I'm having trouble functioning. I'm having trouble getting through my days. I'm having a lot of anxiety. I feel like I might be depressed. We don't know how they're going to react. We worry that they're not going to handle it well, that they may feel burdened by it, that they may judge us. We don't know what they're going to do. But I think that what happens in most cases is that the person really does come toward you. Again, if you're talking about you and not why they're causing you to feel this way.
Lori, Guy, Jessica, this has been wonderful. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much.